There are things I did not understand on the morning of January 14th, 1886, when the county clerk read my name at the table and then read the council's decision in the same flat voice, as though both were equally unremarkable. I did not understand that the 40 acres of creek-bottom scrub they had left me, the parcel my husband's brother Carl called worthless and the council called a fair settlement, was going to save my life. I did not understand that the ground itself was trying to give me something, and that the men in that room who were taking everything else away were, in their confidence, doing me a favor so large they would spend years being ashamed of it. I know that now. In the winter of 1887 going into 1888, the knowledge my father left me inside a folded piece of paper proved heavier than everything those men had taken. On that January morning, I only knew the cold of the floorboards through my boot soles, and the sound of Carl's chair scraping back, and the fact that I had nowhere to go but down. The parcel sat in the low draw east of Harlan Creek, on the Kansas high plains, in country so flat and treeless that a single crow flying over it could be tracked for half a mile before it disappeared. The council had valued the land at $1.20 an acre, 40 acres at $48 total, and Carl's lawyer had written that figure into the settlement as though it were a gift. The good claim, the claim my husband Henrik had filed and farmed and died on, the 320 acres of south-facing sod ground, went to Carl by virtue of blood and the council's unanimous vote. Henrik had been in the ground since February of 1885. He had coughed himself down to nothing over the course of one long winter, and I had sat with him through all of it. And when he was gone, I had tried to keep the claim running for 11 months on my own before Carl came with his lawyer and his papers. I did not fight them loudly. A Norwegian widow with no male kin and no money for her own attorney in a county where Carl Vass was known at every store, and every church social was not going to win a loud fight. I took the 40 acres and I walked out to the wagon and I drove east along the creek road in the January cold, and Sable, my dark bay mare, blew a long breath into the air that rose and vanished, and the sky above the plains was the color of old iron, and I didn't yet know what I was walking toward. What I was walking toward had begun in Norway, 20 years before, in a village on the western coast where my father Peter had built his root cellar and his winter shed not above the ground, but into it. Peter was a practical man and a quiet one, with large, capable hands that could feel a thing before he fully thought it, and a habit of learning by watching the land rather than asking what other men had done on it. He had observed over years of careful attention how the earth held warmth below the frost line, and let go of it only slowly, like a stone that has been sitting in sun all day, and carries the warmth still into the evening, long after the light has gone. He had watched his neighbors build their sheds from timber, and watched them fail when the north wind came in earnest, boards shrinking at their joinery, cold driving through every gap, animals dying of chill rather than hunger, families burning through their wood by February when March was still ahead of them. He had looked at all of that and thought about it, and then he had dug instead. He cut into the hillside behind our house and built a chamber 6 feet below the surface of the frost line, with packed clay walls and a clay and turf roof, and a south-facing entry angled into a short vestibule passage, so that wind could not drive straight through and strip the warmth out in a single gust. He built the passage with a deliberate turn in it, so that anyone coming in had to angle sideways for the last 4 feet before the door, and in that turn, the wind's force broke against the clay wall and lost itself. He had figured that out by holding a candle at the entry of a friend's straight passage cellar in a gale, and watching the flame lean hard all the way to the back wall, and then holding the same candle at the turn of his own passage and watching it stand nearly still. The temperature inside his chamber on the coldest night of any year I remembered never fell below the mid-40s. I had slept there as a girl when the worst storms came and felt the earth pressing warmly on all sides, steady and unhurried, and understood without being told that the cold lives above in the moving air, and the ground below the frost line does not much care what the sky is doing. When I left Norway at 19, I had taken almost nothing, but my mother pressed Pater's folded sketch into my hand at the dock, a thin piece of drafting paper he had made when he built the first chamber, showing the angle of the entry passage, the depth of the walls, the slope of the roof drain, the placement of the turned vestibule. He had died the previous winter, and the sketch was among the things my mother could not keep and could not throw away, and she had decided it belonged with me. I had carried it folded in a small tin box for 18 years. Henrik had never had reason to use it. On the Kansas plains, where timber was scarce and sod was the builder's material, men cut blocks from the earth's surface and stacked them above ground, and that was the way things were done, and no one had dug sideways into a creek bank and tried anything different. I had not tried to explain Peter's principle to anyone. There had been no need. But when I drove Sable out to the creek bottom parcel on that January afternoon in 1886 and walked the low north bank of the draw and saw the 6-foot rise of clay-packed earth, dense and firm and facing south where the winter sun could find an entry, I opened the tin box and unfolded the sketch for the first time in years, and I stood there a long time in the wind. And then I started figuring. I began digging in March of 1886, once the frost had softened enough to work. I started alone, with a spade and a broad-bladed grubbing hoe, cutting horizontally into the north face of the bank, 6 feet below the surface of the draw above. The work was slow and the clay was dense and wet at the depth I was working, and my hands blistered in the first week and healed in the second. And by the third week, the blisters had been replaced by calluses, and the calluses had been replaced by something harder, and the digging went faster. I hauled the spoil out in a canvas sling and piled it along the south edge of the parcel for a windbreak berm I would plant to wild plum and chokecherry come summer. By May, I'd cut 14 feet into the bank and framed the chamber with salvaged cedar posts I had traded 3 days of fence-mending labor to acquire. The chamber itself 12 feet across and rising to a vaulted earthen ceiling I had shaped with a curved scraper I made from a wagon wheel rim. I packed the walls with a lime and clay mortar I mixed in a trough cut from a cottonwood log, and I tamped it in with a wooden mallet until it rang solid and gave nothing under a thumbnail's pressure. I fitted the entry with a low door and a turned vestibule passage, 8 feet long and angled to the east, so that a direct north wind met a wall of packed earth before it found the door. I built a small inner chamber to the right of the main room where Sable could winter without freezing her water, and I ran a single stovepipe up through 6 feet of earth to a cap I made from an old Dutch oven lid, low profile and flush with the ground above, nothing that caught the wind. The floor I laid with flat creek stone, smooth and close-fitted, with a drainage channel cut along the east edge, running to a gravel sump I had filled with creek stone and covered with packed clay. The whole thing looked from the road above the bank like a crack in a creek bank with a door in it. Bert Cale was the first to name it. Bert ran the dry goods store and the post office on the main road through Harlan Township, a broad-shouldered man of 50, with a wide mustache and the habit of standing on his porch in a way that made passing comment feel like formal address. He had known Henrik and had not much use for a widow working a creek-bottom parcel nobody wanted. One afternoon in June of 1886, when I had come to the store for lime and he had looked down the road toward the draw and asked what I was building, I told him an earthen shelter dug into the bank. He turned the toothpick in his mouth and said, "That's a mole hole is what that is." The two men on the porch laughed, a short sound like a door closing, and that was the name it got. By the time I came back for nails and canvas in August, someone had drawn a small mole in chalk on the post by the store door, and nobody had erased it. I want to say now, if you are the kind of person who has been told by confident people that what you were building was foolish, that what I did that summer was not heroic, it was ordinary. I dug because I knew the principle, and the principle was sound, and I could not afford not to. I kept my head down and worked. If you have followed this story this far, and you know something of what it is to be told your work is a molehole by someone standing in comfort, consider leaving a word below, because there are more of you than you might think, and the story is not finished yet. By September of 1886, the main chamber was finished and I had moved in. The floor was packed clay covered with flat creek stone, smooth and cool in summer, holding warmth in winter. I had whitewashed the walls with lime, and they reflected the candlelight so that the space, though underground, was not dark. I had a narrow iron stove against the east wall, a shelf for my provisions, a frame bed with a rope bottom, and Pater's sketch tacked above the lintel where I could see it by the light of the single candle I burned at the table each evening. There was a particular quality to the silence in that chamber that took me some weeks to name. Above the surface, the Kansas plains in October is not silent at all, the grass hissing, the wind finding the corners of every structure, the temperature shifting its weight from hour to hour. Underground, none of that arrived. What arrived instead was stillness of a kind I associated with the inside of a stone church, or with the moment just after a door closes on a storm, a stillness that did not mean nothing was happening, but only that whatever was happening outside had decided not to come in. Sable had her inner chamber, separated from mine by a plank wall with a cutout for heat to pass through, and I had watched her those first weeks to see how she took to it. She took to it better than I expected. She was a practical animal, and what she knew of the chamber was that it was warm and dry and supplied her with hay and water without requiring her to stand in wind, and that was enough. She would come to the cutout in the plank wall sometimes in the evenings and put her nose through and look at me by the candlelight, and I would go over and put my hand on her face, and she would make a low sound and go back to her hay. In October, I laid in 30 bales of prairie hay. I had traded a neighbor for the summer's grubbing work, and I stacked 4 cords of cottonwood and dry cow chips along the outer vestibule wall. I had planted the wild plum slips along the south berm in May, and they had taken. Come winter, they would not be tall, but they were alive, and in 5 years they would be a wall of their own against the south wind's scour. The mole hole, Bert Cale's name for it, was 12 degrees warmer than the air outside by the time the first November frost settled. I measured it with a pocket thermometer Henrik had kept in his survey kit, and I noted the figure in a small ledger I kept on the shelf beside his photograph. The community had its own language for what I was doing. At the church social in October, Clara Prentice asked May Hollis whether anyone had thought to speak to that Norwegian woman about building something proper before winter. May, who was younger than most of the women there, and had a direct way of looking at things that her husband Roy found inconvenient, said she had walked down to the creek bank in August and that it seemed to her like a solid piece of construction. Clara said that digging into a creek bank was the kind of thing a person did who did not know any better, and that it was a pity, because the Norwegian woman had clearly worked hard, and there was no shame in not knowing the Kansas plains if you had not been raised on them. Roy Hollis, standing behind May with his hat in his hands, said something quiet to her, and May set her cup down on the table without answering, and that was the end of that. Bert Cale, standing by the cider table with 2 other men, said the mole hole would flood the first good rain, and that the Norwegian woman had dug herself a grave and called it a house, and that was about the long and short of it. And several people nodded, which Bert took as agreement and may have been simply the movement of people standing in the cold. I was not at the social. I heard this later from May herself in the spring, when things had changed enough that she could tell me. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was cold, but not killing cold. The plains had a long, hard January and a February that came in with ice and went out with more of the same, and I burned less than 2 cords of my 4 in the whole season. Sable did not lose a pound. The chamber temperature on the coldest night of that winter, when the outside air was 17 below, held at 53 degrees. I recorded that in the ledger too. The parcel above the bank was scoured clean by February, and the neighbor's sod house to the north had its west wall buckle under the weight of drifted snow and need a week's repair. I kept quiet about my numbers. Nobody had asked. In the spring of 1887, I extended the inner chamber another 8 feet for a root cellar and dug a drainage channel along the floor's east edge that ran to a gravel sump I had laid when I built the floor. The spring melt came heavy, and the draw flooded its banks for 4 days, and the main chamber stayed dry because the entry vestibule sill was 8 inches above flood stage, and the sump took the seep that came through the walls at the corners. Bert Cale mentioned to a traveling merchant in April that the mole hole had not washed away yet, which he said with the tone of a man who expected the exception to prove itself temporary. In the summer of 1887, the wild plum on the south berm grew to my shoulder, and by fall the chokecherry had spread along the full 40 feet of the berm's face, and the windbreak held the south edge of the parcel from the worst of the November scour. I noticed that November a sky color I had not liked. It was a yellow-green cast along the northwest horizon, not the gray of ordinary overcast, something sharper, like light from a lantern held behind thin cloth. Pater had described a color like that once, on a day when the worst storm of my childhood had arrived by afternoon. He had called it the sky making up its mind. I went home and checked my hay and my wood and found I was short on the hay, and I spent 3 days in early December hauling and trading until I had 50 bales packed into Sable's chamber and another 20 stacked in the vestibule corridor. The neighbors thought I was nervous for nothing. Nels Johansson, who farmed the section to my north, said the autumn had been mild and there was no sign of a hard winter coming, and that he had lived on these plains for 12 years and knew their tempers. He was not wrong about the autumn. He was wrong about what the autumn was promising. On December the 28th of 1887, Bert Cale came out of his store as I was tying Sable to his hitching post and said that Nels Johansson had been asking about the mole hole's construction and that I ought to know that building into a creek bank was a fool's business on the Kansas plains, where the water table was treacherous and the soil would not hold any angle that God had not already fixed. He said a person who dug down on the Kansas plains was a person who did not understand the Kansas plains, and that the mole hole would prove it sooner or later. I looked at him steadily and said that it had held 2 winters and that I was there to buy salt and tobacco. He turned back into the store without another word. Nels Johansson, who had been standing down the porch a little, looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and then looked away. The sky to the northwest that afternoon held that same thin yellow-green light I had seen in November, and I went home and banked the fire higher than usual and filled every vessel in Sable's chamber to the top and stacked the last of the vestibule wood so that I could reach it without opening the outer door fully. On January 9th, 1888, the temperature dropped 15 degrees between noon and sundown. I felt it first through the entry vestibule when I opened the door to bring in an armload of wood, a cold so hard and sudden it did not feel like the ordinary cold of a January evening. but like something decided, something that had been organized and held back and then released all at once. By 4 in the afternoon, the stovepipe cap showed ice where there had been none at noon. By 6, the air outside was at 8 below, and the wind had come up from the northwest. Not the usual wind that pushed along the surface in cold gusts, but a steady pressing weight of air, the kind that finds every gap in a structure and makes each one known. I stoked the stove, filled the water pail, and went to bed with my coat still on, and I listened to the wind work along the surface of the draw above my head, without finding any purchase, without finding any way down. By the morning of January 10th, the temperature had reached 22 below outside, and by noon it had not risen, but had gone to 28 below. And the snow was driving horizontal so that there was no sky and no horizon and no distance, only the close white silence of a world reduced to what it could see in front of its face, which was nothing. I did not open the outer door. The chamber temperature at noon was 51 degrees. I ate cold biscuit and checked on Sable and read Pater's sketch by candlelight, though I had memorized it years ago. And I thought about him standing in the Norwegian hillside with a measuring cord, working out the angles, pressing his hand against the clay wall of the chamber he had cut, saying, "Feel that. The earth is not cold. The sky is cold." I heard the storm through the stovepipe, a low, steady note like a finger run around the rim of a jar, rising and falling as the wind shifted but never stopping, and I could hear faintly the creak of the wild plum canes above the berm bending and coming back, their roots holding in the clay while the air above the berm tried to find something to carry away and found nothing it could move. I stoked the stove at 4-hour intervals. I did not sleep much. There is a particular kind of wakefulness that comes from being warm inside a cold place, not the wakefulness of fear exactly, but of attention, a sense that the warmth you are inside is a thing being maintained and must not be taken for granted, and that the cold outside is not dormant but patient, the way a creditor is patient. I fed Sable her hay at 6 in the morning and again at noon, and I talked to her while I did it, not saying anything in particular, only talking the way you talk to an animal that is calm in a situation that is not calm, to hold the calmness between you. She ate steadily and without alarm. By the afternoon of the 10th, the temperature outside, which I checked by cracking the vestibule's inner door a 1/4 inch and holding the thermometer in the gap, had reached 31 below. The knock came at 4 in the afternoon on the 10th, a faint sound against the entry vestibule's outer door that I might not have heard if the chamber had been noisier. When I opened the vestibule's inner door and then the outer, May Hollis came through the passage first, her face gray and her eyes very wide, and behind her Roy Hollis carried one of their children and led the other by the hand. They had walked from their sod house 3/4 of a mile to the north, through the driving snow, keeping the wind on their left shoulders by feel. Roy said the north wall of the sod house had failed at noon, and the interior temperature had dropped to 10 degrees above before he got it patched with their only spare canvas, and that the wind had found every seam in the canvas as fast as he pressed it. He said May had told him where the door was. May had known the vestibule's angle and the low sill and the turn passage because she had walked down and asked me about it in August, quietly, on a day when her husband was away, and I had shown her, and she had looked at everything carefully and said nothing, and remembered it all. I put them inside and stoked the fire and gave May the blanket from my bed and settled both children against Sable's warm flank in the inner chamber, where the horse stood calm in the deep hay, unconcerned by the sound of the wind above and the cold she could not feel. The chamber held its temperature through the night. On the morning of January 11th, The outside temperature was 38 below, which was the figure I recorded in the ledger at first light when I cracked the vestibule's inner door and held out the thermometer. 38 below, and inside my earthen chamber, it was 52 degrees, and the candle on the shelf did not waver. There are things that do not need long sentences. 11 people died in Harlan Township in those 3 days. 4 of them died of cold that got into structures that could not hold against a sustained temperature of 30 and 35 and 38 below. Roofs collapsing under the wind's lateral load, walls going porous with ice, fires eating through the fuel before the storm had reached its second day. 3 families on the southern edge of the township spent the worst of it burning furniture to stay alive. The Peterson family on the North Road lost 2 cattle. In Nora Voss's mole hole, 4 people and 1 horse spent 71 hours below ground, and the temperature in that chamber did not fall below 50 degrees on any reading I made. Those are the 2 numbers. The sky above the draw had decided the question the council could not settle, and it had done it without asking anyone's opinion. Bert Cale came on January the 12th, when the wind had dropped enough to see. He came on foot down the road to the draw, a large man made smaller by the cold, moving carefully in the drift. He stopped at the bottom of the draw and looked at the entry door, and I opened it, and the warmth that had built in the chamber behind me came out around my shoulders into the cold air. I saw him feel it on his face before his expression changed. He stood in the bitter cold outside and felt the warmth rolling out of the earth, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Roy Hollis came and stood behind me in the doorway. May was sitting inside at the small table with a cup of water, and the children were still asleep in the inner chamber, and Sable made a slow, easy sound in the hay. Bert Cale looked at the entry and looked at the earthen ceiling visible above the door, and looked at me. And he took off his hat, and he said, "She built right." He didn't say it loudly. He said it to Roy, or to no one in particular. He put his hat back on and stood a moment looking at the wild plum windbreak, half buried in snow, but standing above the berm. And then he looked at the entry again, and he walked back up the road. Walt Dunn, the land recorder for Harlan County, came out in April of 1888, when the plains were running with snowmelt and the draw was running full and brown. He came because 3 people had mentioned the mole hole to him, and one had called it something more careful, naming it an earthen bermed shelter with a turned vestibule entry and a clay-packed overhead seal. He had paper and a measuring cord, and he spent 4 hours in the chamber, and the vestibule and the inner stall, writing down the dimensions and the construction sequence I described to him. When we were done, I took Pater's sketch out of the tin box and showed it to him, and I told him that the principle was not mine, but my father's, and that the principle was plain. The earth below the frost line holds a steady temperature that is above freezing, and a shelter sealed into that earth and sealed above it will hold that temperature against any surface. Cold the sky can manage, and the only inheritance that mattered in a hard country was the kind you could not lose, because it lived in your understanding, rather than in a deed or a title. Walt Dunn wrote that down. He was a careful man. He published his notes in the county recorder's annual supplement that summer, and a land agent in Dodge City reprinted the section on earthen bermed construction in a settlement pamphlet. Several homesteaders came out to Harlan Township that fall to look at the vestibule and the turned passage. Most of them got the shape close to right but did not understand the vestibule's angle. And their shelters were colder than mine because a direct wind could find a nearly straight line through. A few of them came back and asked me to walk their sites, and I did, and I explained the angle, and those structures held better. Knowledge passes imperfectly from eye to eye, my father had believed, but it passes whole from hand to hand. From the person who has felt the principle at work in their own walls to the person pressing their first clay, it does not travel in pamphlets. It travels in the work. Bert Cale never called it the Mole Hole again after January of 1888. What he called it was the Vass Shelter, which was as close to a correction as a man like Bert was going to offer, and I took it as what it was. He sent his brother-in-law to me in the fall of 1888 with questions about the vestibule angle, and I answered them. His brother-in-law built a passable, bermed shelter on the south edge of the county that stood for 30 years. May Hollis brought me a jar of pickled beets that March, walking down through the mud to the draw without being asked, and she set the jar on my shelf and looked at the whitewashed walls and the candle and Pater's sketch above the lintel, and she said it was a fine house. I told her it was fine because my father had built one like it 40 years before, in a cold country, and had thought carefully about what the earth was trying to offer to anyone willing to dig for it. May stayed an hour, and we drank tea, and she looked at the sketch for a long time, without asking if she could hold it, and then asked. And I gave it to her, and she held it with both hands. It was not fragile. It was only a piece of paper, and what it contained was not on the paper at all. The wild plum on the south berm flowered that spring for the first time, a pale froth along the top of the berm that smelled of something almost sweet. And Sable turned out on the parcel in April, walked the length of the berm twice with her nose working, curious about the scent of something blooming in what had been bare ground. By the summer of 1890, the plum and chokecherry windbreak was taller than my head, and the berm behind it had grown a thick skin of grass and creeping root that sealed the clay against rain scour. I had been offered $200 for the parcel in the spring of 1889, and I had declined. Carl Vass sold the claim in 1891 and moved his family to Colorado, and I will leave that where it is, as a fact and not a judgment. Walt Dunn's supplement was cited in an agricultural land use report in 1892 and again in 1901, and the term he had used, earthen bermed shelter with turned vestibule entry, appeared in a Kansas homestead manual in 1903, illustrated with a cross-section drawing that was not quite right, but was close enough to be useful. I saw the drawing in the summer of 1904 when a neighbor showed me the manual, and I recognized the angle my father had worked out by candlelight on a cold Norwegian hillside and sent across the ocean folded inside a tin box with his daughter, knowing, I believe, that the drawing was not the knowledge, and that the knowledge was going wherever she went. What I could not have told you in 1888, when the visitors were coming to look at the vestibule and copy down the dimensions, was how the knowledge would travel from that point, and how much of it would survive the transmission. Some of them built shelters that held well for a generation. Some built shelters that kept the shape without understanding the principle, and those shelters were colder than they needed to be. And when a hard winter came, those families were cold and assumed the design was flawed rather than the understanding. The knowledge that travels in paper is always a little thinner than the knowledge that travels in hands, and the knowledge that travels in hands is always a little thinner than the knowledge that travels in the body, in the memory of a cold hillside, and a father pressing your palm against packed clay and telling you to feel what the earth already knows. I taught the vestibule angle to the families who came back and asked with their hands and their eyes open, and those shelters held. The ones who took the pamphlet and went home without asking held less well. That is the way of it, and it was the same in Harlan Township in 1889 as it was in Norway in Peter's time, and as it likely is wherever a cold country asks a person to learn faster than they have been prepared to. Nels Johansson, who had told me the autumn was mild and there was no sign of hard winter coming, built a bermed shelter the fall of 1888. He came to me in September of that year with his hat in his hands and asked how deep the vestibule passage wanted to be, and I told him 8 feet at the minimum, and I showed him the angle. He was a good listener when he chose to be. His shelter stood until 1921, when his son sold the parcel and the new owner did not keep it up, and it silted in. But it held 33 winters, and Nels never lost an animal to cold again after 1888. And he told people so when they asked, and some of those people came to me. And some of those people built shelters of their own. I am old now, and the draw is quiet, and the plum thicket that started from cuttings I planted in the spring of 1886 has spread to 3 times its original length along the berm, and in May it is full of small birds that arrive at first light and make a great business of it. Sable has been gone since 1901, buried at the east edge of the parcel, and I set a fieldstone at the head of her plot that is still there, tilted now by 30 years of frost and thaw. The entry vestibule has been rebuilt twice, the door replaced, the clay walls resurfaced by my own hands, and in the last years by the hands of May Hollis's daughter, who came to learn the work when May could no longer manage the walk down the bank. The chamber itself, cut 14 feet into the north face of that bank, sealed above by 6 feet of packed clay, with the stovepipe rising through the earth to its low cap, is as sound as the day I finished it in the fall of 1886. My father, Pater, taught me that the cold lives in the moving air, and the moving air lives above. What lives below does not much move, and what does not move cannot carry the cold down to where you are. It is not a complicated principle. It is the principle of patience, the understanding that what you cannot fight directly, you can refuse by going somewhere the fight cannot follow. I did not learn that in a schoolroom or a courthouse. I learned it from a man who dug into a Norwegian hillside with a spade, pressed his hands against the clay wall of the chamber he had cut, and said to feel it. On a morning in late January, when the plains wind comes in from the northwest and scours the high ground, and the draw above is white, and the air above the berm is moving fast and hard, there is still warmth in that chamber, steady and unhurried, the way the earth itself is steady and unhurried, indifferent to what the sky thinks it has decided. The plum thicket above stands in the wind and does not break. The fieldstone at Sable's plot is cold on its north face, and holds the cold it has gathered all night. But 6 inches below the frost line, under the stone and the packed clay and the sump gravel, the temperature is what it always is, which is enough. Below it, the earth holds what it has always held, the slow warmth of the world's deep patience, waiting for whoever is willing to dig down far enough to find it.